So that dude is Alan Greenspan. He was chair of the Federal Reserve during the 2000s, during the run up, during the 1990s also. But during the part of 2000s where we were running up toward the financial crisis. And in his book, when he wrote his kind of memoirs of life, he basically said, I kind of knew what was coming, but I thought the financial system was strong enough to withstand it. And that's a great admission. If he knew it, then really should have done something about it. But who? Anyway, so the old school, the pre-1993, the pre-Alan Greenspan world, the Fed set a target of the money supply. The Fed said, we want the money supply to be X or Y or Z. And there's problems with that. One of which is the Fed is okay at controlling the money supply, but not perfect at controlling the money supply. There's difficulties in it trying to control the money supply, which you should already realize. Okay? During Alan Greenspan's time at the Fed, they switch. Now, it's not just him, right? Other Fed chairs had really used interest rates as their primary tool. Paul Volcker, this guy Paul Volcker, who we'll talk about being one of them. But it's Greenspan that publicly changes the public stance of the Fed so that the Fed is targeting the federal funds rate as its primary tool. What does the Fed funds rate do? And again, what's the federal funds rate? It's the rate that banks charge each other for very short-term loans. Okay? If you don't have enough reserves and you need more reserves, you go to this federal fund market, and another bank that has too many reserves will temporarily loan you reserves so that you can have enough reserves to meet your rules. Now remember that during this period, during the Alan Greenspan days and during the old days, banks always had to meet a certain amount of reserves. They had a legal requirement. These are your reserves that you must meet. And that was based on their deposits, right? So whatever their deposits were, they had to have, even if it meant they had to cut back. Even if it meant during bad times they had to not make loans and drop loans and do things that were bad for the economy, they had to keep this percent of their deposits. Okay? And starting in March of 2020, right, they don't have to do that anymore. All right. So the Fed funds market, again, now is different than it used to be because the Federal Reserve is not walking into your bank once a week and making sure you have your reserve requirement met. They have other things they're doing. They've changed the way they deal with banks, and so the Fed funds market's different. But this is a short-term borrowing. This is banks borrowing from each other basically overnight when they have a problem. So if somebody comes into that bank and takes a whole bunch of money out, or a loan, something happens with a loan and they need they just need reserves so they can cover, right? Lots of businesses, again, we talked about this and we'll talk about it again. Lots of businesses have these lines of credit where the bank has agreed to loan them money when they need it, right? And the company is not always using it. The company might never use it. The company might use it, 1 week out of 5 years. But the bank has to have reserves so that it can cover that if that company walks in and asks for that money. We don't want the bank to say no, okay? Again, going back to 2007, 8, 9, there were lots of profitable, functional businesses that went out of business because their banks would not loan them their money against their line of credit. So they had a pre-approved line of credit that they thought they could tap. The economy does the economy thing. They go to the bank to tap that line of credit, and the bank says no. And the company goes bankrupt, even though it's a fine, functional company. You're a home builder. If you're a custom home builder and that's all you do, you build, a home every other month, right? You're building 5 or 6 homes a year, and that's your job. They don't pay you for the house before it's built. You have to borrow the money to build the house, and then who's ever buying that house from you pays you when the house is done. Well, what happens if your bank cuts you off? Now you can't build houses because you can't get a loan. The homeowner can't get a loan because the home isn't built. You can't get a loan because the banks deny it. Your company goes bust even though you had customers. Okay? So the idea of this now is that these banks have to be able to cover these lines of credit. So when people come in to ask for the use of their line of credit, the bank has to have reserves to be able to fund that line of credit, which is not something they had to do prior to recent days, but is something that they do now. So the Fed funds rate is always the lowest rate in the market. Why? So all other interest rates are going to be higher than the Fed funds rate. And the reason is that if I'm a bank and I know that in an emergency I'm going to have to pay 2.5% in the Fed funds market to cover something, I'm always going to charge more than 2.5%. I'm never going to want to put myself in a position where I might lose money on a loan. So if your line of credit is you come in and say, hey, I want a line of credit, and your line of credit were 2%. If I had to borrow overnight to cover your line of credit, I'm losing money because 2.5% that I'm paying to the other bank is more than the 2% you're paying me on that line of credit. So everything the bank does is going to be higher than the federal funds rate, so that if the bank has to borrow to cover, it still can make money because the amount that you're paying the bank is higher than the amount the bank has to pay to borrow the money to give to you. Does that make sense? Think about that. Okay? So again, the old school thought on this was the Fed controlled it by changing the money supply. So the Fed would use open market operations, change the money supply, and set the Fed funds rate. And when we say set the Fed funds rate, the Fed wouldn't say, hey, the Fed funds rate needs to be 2.5. They would say it needs to be between 2.25 and 2.75. Okay? And they still do that today. They set a range for it. They want it to be in between because there's a market out there, and that market's moving, and they don't want to have to try to force that market to sit at one number. So there's a range, and as long as it's inside that range, then they're happy about it. Okay? Now, the New World Order, 2008, the Fed starts paying interest on reserves and excess reserves. So there's the interest rate on reserves and interest rate for excess reserves, which were the same. Now we have this new system where there's no such thing as an excess reserve. There's only a reserve. All reserves are just reserves. Okay? All reserves are created equal. So now we just have the IOR, the interest rate on reserves, and that's the primary thing the Fed is going to worry about is this interest rate on reserves. Okay? We operate in what's called this ample reserve regime, where the Fed makes sure that there are ample reserves, that there's lots of reserves in the system, and there's way more reserves in the system than there used to be. So the Fed makes sure that there's lots and lots of reserves in the system, and then sets the IOR. Now, the IOR is going to be the lowest interest rate. Why? Well, let's suppose that the Fed decides that the IOR should be 3%. So a bank can take any money it's got, put it in an account at the Federal Reserve, and get 3% interest on it. And that is absolutely safe because the Fed can always pay its bills because it can go to the Treasury and say, hi, print me up a couple $100 billion. Okay? So you know that 3% is a perfectly safe investment. It's as safe as an investment as you can get. Somebody comes to you and says, hey, I want to get a line of credit and I want a 2.5%. Well, you're nuts if you give that to them. Right? Why would you give a customer who may or may not pay you back a 2.5% when you can get 3% from the Fed? So whatever the Fed sets as this interest rate on reserves, every other interest rate on the planet Earth is going to be higher than that. Okay? Every other interest rate on the planet Earth is going to be higher than that. So why are mortgage rates where they are? Well, the Fed sets the IOR, and you know that mortgage rates are going to be a little bit above that IOR wherever they set it. Okay? Is that exciting? Do we get that? This is all about opportunity cost, right? Economists, we're so smart. Opportunity cost, it's everywhere. The IOR is always going to be the lowest interest rate because why would you loan somebody money at less than you can earn? You wouldn't. All right. So the Fed, this theory, this ample reserve theory, is based on the following graph, okay? Which says, again, that all interest rates are going to be above the IOR. So wherever the Fed sets the IOR, the demand curve gets kinky, okay? So at this point, ooh, that was bad. All right. So demand, right? There's a demand for reserves. Reserve demand. There's a supply of reserves. The supply of reserves. Okay? And normally you'd think, well, demand and supply, right? Supply kind of fixed. But what? What? What do we know? Well, nobody, once the Fed sets the IOR, so if the Fed here has set the IOR at 1, the Fed sets the interest rate on reserves at 1, the federal funds rate will never go below 1, ever. So whatever this IOR is, the demand curve just kinks and goes off at that. Okay? As long as we have lots of reserves, and so we're out here, right? We're out here, we have lots of reserves, and we're out here, then the Fed funds rate and the IOR are basically going to be the same. Okay? So the opportunity cost of loaning out reserves is the IOR. You're not going to send another bank, right? Remember, Fed funds rate is my bank loaning your bank some money. Well, if the IOR is 1, I'm not loaning you money at less than 1. In fact, I might even not loan you money at 1. Okay? Everybody with me on that? If I can get the Fed to pay me 1%, why would I loan you money at 0.5%? Well, I wouldn't. Okay? So as long as there's a ton of reserves in the system, there's enough reserves that we're out in this flat part of reserves, the supply of reserves is large, ample, right? Then the Fed funds rate is going to be essentially the same as the IOR. And the Fed can set the Fed funds rate by just setting the IOR. Okay? So again, the Fed sets the IOR, then makes sure reserves are ample. And this setting process of reserves is something called the LCR, and we'll be back to that in a second. Okay? I know. This is more complicated than you thought it would be. But now you know stuff that other people don't, because if somebody took this class in 2019, they didn't know this stuff because, yeah, they might have learned about the IOR, but they still had fractional reserve banking in 2019, and now you're the new fancy generation who knows stuff that other people don't know, right? So what happens now if reserves are not ample? This occasionally happens in the real world. Not for very long, because as soon as it happens, the Fed will go do something. And we'll talk about this here in a second. So remember, the Fed controls interest rates by setting the IOR, but that only works if there are ample reserves. If reserves shrink back to the other line, then the Fed funds rate is not now controlled by the Fed. It's going to go up by whatever the market tells it to. And so we've had instances where interest rates have taken huge jumps up that the Fed did not want. And the reason was that we didn't have ample reserves. Okay? So the Fed has to make sure that we always have ample reserves. Okay? But again, if they do it right, the IOR is equal to the Fed funds rate. So if they keep the line out, far out to the right, if they keep that supply of reserves, RS, far enough out, they don't have a problem. The IOR and the Fed funds rate will be basically the same. If they let the reserves fall, then the Fed funds rate starts climbing, or whatever other interest rate they're dealing with starts climbing, because supply and demand, right?